I want that early stuff too. Yeah, I will get that.
Yeah, I'm probably good at the transition from the 60s to the 70s.
Yeah.
This goes up my shirt.
Yep.
And comes out my neck.
Let me get this. We'll try to get this. This time, let's do it in the way we try to make it actually point up.
Okay.
The last two interviews, it somehow winds up pointing down.
It's true. That was odd, wasn't it?
Yeah, I just can't seem to. These things are
slippers sort of don't go in the right direction.
I know, but they are such sensitive mics.
You done many of these so far?
Well, this round of interviews is just still in the early stages. You're like the fourth one.
Oh, yeah.
And we'll have maybe another 15 people before it's all said and done. I'm going to be interviewing until mid-October, I think. And it's having a dual purpose. I think I mentioned I have a grant from the Humanities Council that's for this project specifically called Ecology Emerges. Yeah. We might invite you to be a part of it.
You know, somebody I never see in any of these is Karen Pickett over in...
You know, I have her on my list, actually. She's somebody I want to... I've done an interview with her when I did the...
I just never see her in any of these interviews or whatever.
She should be. Yeah.
Person, yeah.
Well, she lives in Canyon, or she did, and that's a very reclusive group. I mean, they wouldn't be there. It's the bulliness of these big.
Yeah, I know. Canyon Cinema started there.
I'm going to grab the water over, too.
Famous Canyon Cinema. Could you tell me your name?
Peter Berg.
We're going to do that again.
Can you tell me where you were born?
Jamaica, Long Island, New York.
Another New Yorker. Long Island.
How about that?
That's good.
Like that?
Yeah.
Give it a little more headroom.
Maybe a little bit back from there to start.
Start with that. That's pretty nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And that's down. And can you? How long have you lived here?
For at least 45 years.
We're good. Are we rolling?
We're rolling.
Okay, I'm going to start this one. Record. And that's going. That's on the same channel, Judy. Is that okay? It just picked up after the 2 hours.
No, it's a different one.
It's okay. Great. All right, so we're just going to take it from the top again. Tell us your name, when you came to the Bay Area, where you settled, and what you did during your first years.
Peter Berg. I first came to the Bay Area when I was 17. I hitchhiked out to meet the Beats in North Beach. Wandered around a lost teenager. Coevolution Bagel Shop. Did I say coevolution? No. Coexistence.
That's right. I was just going, that's not quite right. Yeah, good.
Coexistence Bagel Shop.
You're mixing your 60s and 70s.
And went back, did a whole personal odyssey with the civil rights movement until I was in my middle 20s, and then I hitchhiked back out here and decided to live here.
And that was about 64?
64.
Yeah. And what did you do when you first came to San Francisco? What occupied your time for the first couple of years you were here?
I jumped a freight in Portland, Oregon. It was a lumber freight. I sat in the middle of piles of lumber. It was a lumber freight. They leave a hole in the middle on a flat car. You can jump in there and ride as long as you want. Came over Mount Shasta in moonlight, very cold. Not actually over the mountain, but beside it, Dunsmuir.
Yeah, I know exactly the route.
The train slowed down to make the crest of the hill, and I jumped out and grabbed an icicle for water, and ended up in the Emeryville freight yard. Jumped out Albany freight yard, and the first place I saw that was a natural place was Albany Hill. I climbed it, slid down it, fell, and then ran into some people in Berkeley and went to their house, and we all had a lot of stories to tell each other, and I ended up taking LSD and falling in love with someone, and that was my introduction to the Bay Area.
Sounds pretty good. And so from then, right away, then you were ensconced in sort of alternative living here in the Bay Area.
Exactly.
not seeking a wage labor.
Well, I was very
or-
puzzled by living in America. I mean, it was 1964. It was not a good time in terms of easy access to a way of life. So I felt conflicted by a lot of things and had a happy introduction.
That's
Good
the
welcome.
beginning. What were your first experiences with ecological activism?
I had hitchhiked to Mexico when I was in my late teens. And I lived there without money for about a month. And was in the city of Guadalajara. And I was sitting on a curb wondering what I would do because I was broke. I'd really thrown myself on the fates. And a man came by and asked me for a cigarette. And I told him I didn't have one and that I didn't have any money. And he laughed at me because I was a gringo, he said. And then asked if I wanted to come home with him and live with his family. So I did, and I lived with them for at least a week, maybe 10 days. We hunted together. He had a smooth bore shotgun that he used coconut husk for wadding. You could see the shot come out of the shotgun. We hunted rabbits. My first shot missed by 20 feet at least. I mean, I could see the shot fall behind the rabbit. So they sent me up the canyon to flush rabbits, which I did. And then they took me home, gave me some part of the rabbit. I donated it back to the household. They loved that little ritual. And I began to see how people live who are more intimate with the land than the Anglo industrial tourist culture that I grew up in. So I came back and had a culture shock. A lot of people do, of course, a reverse culture shock of re-entry into this hyper society, hyper and cold society. And I think that was the ecological, I think the lens shifted to see nature as endangered at that point and needing human support was that experience.
Did you have a conception of nature that you can remember prior to that experience that sort of started your starting point of what's nature is this other thing, or how did you conceive
The
of
ultimate good.
Uh-huh.
The ultimate
You'd already
good.
saw it that way, in that light.
Yeah, my family had two sons in World War II. My mother was an early escapee to Florida to get a divorce. We were Northerners transplanted into the South. I saw nature in the South, but human culture had an aversion to racism, very strong. My whole family did, really. Eventually they either became like the culture or rebelled against it, and I was one of the rebels. Oh, I didn't feel as though I belonged there. Mm-hmm. But I did ask to be dropped off in the Everglades one night and lived alone in the Everglades for a day and a night when I was 12. So I began to think of nature as the good.
That's a pretty dramatic thing to do at that age. You asked.
I was overly dramatic.
Yeah,
I did other things. I remember going into a sand lot. They're called sand lots, and defying God to kill me if he existed. And nothing happened, so I picked up atheism in a similar way. That was that.
Well, I wonder what your idea about the relationship of humanity and nature was. I mean, it's very interesting the way you described the rabbit experience in Mexico. That sounds like a formative moment. But I wonder if you could describe the difference between your idea of the relationship between humanity and nature in your early thinking and how that's changed, if at all, over the ensuing decades.
I thought nature would be able to take care of itself. I always thought of it as being the ultimate good and that it was a source of continual revival, that it revived itself. It was taking care of itself. And I became aware that it wasn't. I was a political activist I was very deep in the civil rights movement. I would say I was into the radical black movement. When I came to the San Francisco Meme Troupe and told them that I was a writer, director, actor, and they said, prove it, and asked me to write a play for them. At that time, I had a sensibility of radical politics that I believed was beyond what was there. They weren't that radical when I first joined them. They were in the process of becoming radical. The leadership of the Meme Troupe became more or less annealed to the New Left. In fact, the New Left Review office was next to the San Francisco Meme Troupe office. But my sense of radical politics was extreme, and I was revolutionary. When I joined the Meme Troupe, I was really dealing with political, abstract political concepts. But somewhere along the line, I became separated out from usual urban coffee shop discussing politics into activism, and I put activism together with nature.
Already at that moment?
It was gradual, but by the time I was in the Diggers, it was part of why I was doing the Diggers.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, how is the ecology team informing that experience?
How did ecology come into forming that experience?
Kind of you've sort of developed a sensibility that's not common at that era yet. It's coming, but it hasn't quite sunk into a lot of people, this sort of ecological sensibility that you're describing. And so
well, it probably isn't relevant for this conversation to talk about the theory of theater that I was working with, but it was a theory of theater that led me from the Meme Troupe to the Diggers. I saw the Diggers as theater. I always wrote about the Diggers as theater. And since I was one of the principal people there, that was incorporated as a point of view by other people as well. I thought we were life acting. But what we were life acting around essentially was surplus. It was the surplus of the late 60s, which was the Great Society. And people actually left automobiles at the door of the free store with the pink slip under the windshield wiper. We had a surplus of white shirts from people quitting their downtown jobs and dropping out. And nobody wanted these white shirts in the free store. So a woman who'd been studying Eastern fabric decoration showed us how to tie-dye them. And that's where tie-dyeing came into the psychedelic revolution, was through that woman on the floor of the free store with people dipping their shirts into these.
Surplus white office shirts.
And making white office shirts into this stunning apparel.
That's fantastic.
Can I ask what the name of the what was the? There was a name for the theater philosophy that led. That you mentioned this comes from a certain way, but what would, could you put a name to it? Or?
The philosophy of the Diggers was everything is free, do your own thing. And anything that flowed forward from that. And it was a very radical precept. Anarchist, more anarchist than traditional ideological left.
Or traditional anarchists, for that matter.
Yeah, it could be. At any rate, I wrote a piece about the free store as a theater, and in it I used the phrase industrialization was a way to win breakfast from 19th century ecology. And Paul Krasner, by the way, saw that and went to the dictionary to look up the word ecology. It was in 1966, when that was written, it was still not in his pocket dictionary. So he had to ask me what it meant.
Wow. That's being there at the beginning.
Yeah. The Meme Troupe had done a protest against the freeway going through the Haight-Ashbury.
So can you tell us that story a little bit?
I wasn't a direct part of it. It was a little before I got there. but I can tell you what it was about. The Haight-Ashbury was the only neighborhood in California that ever protested against having a freeway go through the panhandle of Golden Gate Park. And the meme troupe went right to their side in this protest because it was so, well, in terms of urban consciousness at the time, it's a pretty radical idea to not have a freeway extension. Most people were still being yahooed onto freeways as a good thing. So the meme troupe actually went there and played songs and joined the protesters. So there was that. There was the Native American movement, which has always been underrated in terms of its influence on the ecology consciousness. It was huge. It had a huge effect. Do you recall that Stuart Brand of Whole Earth catalog fame put out a poster, a huge poster, that said America Needs Indians? That's all it said. He had two expressions that he used often. One was, when will we see a picture of the whole earth? And the other was, America Needs Indians. You know, it's very obvious to me that both of those things had a strong effect on the environment and then ecology movements.
So did you ever do any formal study of ecology or related topics? And if so, where?
I was really lucky. Something happened to me that can only happen to a desperate person. I was on my way to the UN Environment Conference in Stockholm, Sweden in 1972. I had made a bunch of videotapes that I called Homeskin Pony Express. It was made of episodes on different rural communes. And it was an attempt to introduce communards to each other across the country. I actually had gone across the country with a video camera doing this. A porta-pack, it's when they first came out. So I would show these two communal groups, and they would make one for the next communal group. Well, I went to Stockholm as a representative of North American communes to show these videos and express the concerns that people voiced who lived in them about the environment. Well, on the way, I rekindled a relationship with a poet named Alan Van Newkirk, who was an expatriate American in Canada, not a draft resistor. He was resisting a gun charge from the Newark riots. At any rate, Alan had been using the word bioregion, and he liked it. It comes from late 19th century German natural science investigations, and Russians were really very good at this kind of eco-geographic perception. But bioregion, the way he used it, came out of a German sort of tradition, and he only saw bioregions in terms of their natural systems, which was native plants and animals, climate, landform, soil. He wasn't yet aware of the phrase watershed. He's a poet, and he was far-seeing in that, but he had grown very disaffected about being involved with people in politics. So when I suggested that bioregion was a pretty good term if you were going to include people and their culture in a geography, in a restorative way, an ecologically restorative way, bioregion was a pretty good cultural term, not science. You know, don't try to make science out of it. Keep it as culture and maybe popular culture. Try to create popular culture around that idea. He was very resistant to this. He did not want human beings in bioregions. He wanted those ideas separate. So, but as we talked, he described a way of seeing natural areas on the planet that had been developed by Raymond F. Dassman. And Ray Dassman is an incredibly important American ecological figure. At the same time as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, he had written The Destruction of California. based on his experience in World War II, where he had seen big machines, DCATs, used to make airfields, and then brought back to the U.S. and used to knock down forests. And Ray was a bona fide world-class ecologist. He had worked for the World Wildlife Fund and had developed a series of maps called Biotic Provinces of the World, where he made lines on the map according to what was the biotic similarity of different areas. Mm-hmm. And every place was a biotic province. So Alan introduced me to his work, and I just wrote directly to Ray and said, I like your ideas a lot. Why don't we put people in it and make a movement out of it that would be socio-political? And Ray wrote back and said, that's exactly what needs to be done. And
this is when around 71 or so?
I even feel the hair stand up the back of my neck now because, this is jumping. There are a couple of conceptual leaps going on here. And when you do that kind of thing, you're flying blind. And just to hit like that and to suddenly meet this man who was thoroughly disillusioned with environmentalism, thought that the planet was going to hell as fast as people could possibly send it there, and very little or nothing could be done about it. And if anything was done, it would have to be cultural. He had no idea how. And he knew that I had been with the Diggers, and he had been reading about the Diggers for some reason, maybe his daughters. He had several daughters who were college age. At any rate, he and I became running partners. When he came to the United States, this is after Stockholm and all of that. When he came to the United States, he came back to California. He was in Switzerland at the time. And we were almost constant friends. We were constant friends, but also companions. We've made trips around the state. He showed me how to look at nature in a through the veil. He taught me how to ask questions by asking questions. Like, he would ask me questions as though I was the authority on something. Like, Peter, why do you think coyotes shit on stumps? And I didn't even know they did, right? He said, well, let's go look. And we walked into Sierra Nevada, walked around and found some stumps. There was coyote shit on it. And I said, could it possibly be that they don't have any regard for what human beings are doing to trees? And he said, that's a very good answer. Now tell me, why do deer run down cliffs and leave their prints on the sand of the beach headed for the water? What are they doing?
Escaping.
No idea what they're doing. But it was that kind of questioning that made me see that it's mostly questions, not answers. The real beauty of nature is the questions, not imposing, your important scientific mind on them. And this guy was an important scientific mind who had pretty much acquiesced to the failure of contemporary culture to incorporate nature in a way that was harmonious and beneficial. He told me the only real bioregionalists he ever met were Fiji Islanders. He said he walked up to one at a bar one time after all this was underway, the bioregional stuff, and discussed what he was interested in, and the guy at the bar said, I am a re-inhabitant.
I guess that was before the water company grabbed their name from them. But, yeah, that's interesting. That's a good story.
So that was a launching spot for, okay, now let's try to do this in a communal way, interactive, mutualistic, participative way. So we started Planet Drum Foundation as an attempt to link people together who were beginning to think that way, and also land-based groups. And some of the first people that were attracted to it were poets, which is a really good sign. Because poets started writing me and saying, are you really serious about this? Who else do you know that's doing this? Anthropologists, landscape architects, a strange mix of people, community activists saying we need actually a different way of thinking of who are we all in this place. And it sounds like this watershed bioregion idea is a pretty good one for that. Here's what we're going to do about it. And then we had already formed Planet Drum Foundation, so then we started Raise the Stakes, which was the tabloid journal for connecting people and telling their stories, or letting them tell their stories. We never proposed to be the Audubon Society, franchising chapters of bioregionalists. We thought people that lived someplace would be the best source of information about what that place was in ecological human terms. And they would tell us. If they told us, then we would disseminate it to other people. We never tried to brand it.
Right. And what was the relationship between your early efforts around, you're talking to Ray Dasman and learning all this amazing stuff, and I assume you're reading a bunch of books at the same time and kind of steeping yourself in a new sort of depth of sensibility. At the same time, they're passing laws at the federal level around clean water and clean air, and the Endangered Species Act comes along in 72 or 73, and there's all these mainstream environmental groups that are out there, sort of rising up there, Sierra Club and Natural Resources. So what was your relationship to them, and or criticism of them, and or sense of what the efficacy of that effort was, and why you were doing what you were doing?
I thought they were stuffed shirts. I thought there was a lot of careerism, a lot of middle-class values. I thought a lot of them were anthropocentric. I thought they were human-centered. Sierra Club once sent me a promotion to put an ad in Sierra Magazine, and it was a demographic profile of the average Sierra Club member. And this was to promote me so that I would see the financial benefit of advertising. And it was, average income that was way above normal income, and disposable money, like $15,000 a year for a vacation, and excursions to Tierra del Fuego, and the most common cars were Volvos and Mercedes-Benzes. I mean, the most common liquor was Scotch. I mean, it was like, who were these people? It seemed to me that these were the people that I was rebelling against. So when I say that I think they were behaving as stuffed shirts, I'm not trying to put down the intensity of interest that some people in that movement, in those movements, or those organizations had. It's the style of it, the whole zeitgeist of man and nature seemed to me to be off. It seemed to me they were spectators of nature rather than involved in it. They weren't willing to give up the benefit of anthropocentric viewpoint, dominating the earth. They didn't want to quite give up that perspective. They wanted to keep that, but also be nice to nature. And
it's a classic liberal mentality, really. They're always about not changing any of the fundamental social relationships, but just being nice about it, so to speak.
Well, I don't mean to, shove it all off the edge of the planet. What I'm saying is that I believe that with the founding of the EPA in 1972, which I believe was the Nixon administration, wasn't it?
That's right. That's
true. That the environmental movement became institutionalized. After that, it was much more common to run into groups like the Natural Resources Defense Fund, which sounds as though it's people that are defending natural resources, but actually it's lawyers, all lawyers, who are suing the government, including the EPA, for various political and legal gains, but were retaining that same career middle class view. So I think the environment movement as an interesting, engaging thing ended with the founding of Earth Day and the EPA. So since 1972, if you've been an honest person in regard to your identity and the identity of the planet, your identity within the biosphere, you really wouldn't want to be involved with those ends. That there was a whole other area, huge area, of redefinition to harmonize with natural systems rather than to protect or defend or whatever.
What's your take on the direct action and protests and demonstrations that emerged outside of the sort of dirty dozen that were the big institutional environmental groups? There's a lot of stuff like from the anti-nuclear movement in the mid-'70s. Earth First emerges soon after that. What was your sense of that as that started to show up, somewhat building a little bit on your logic of really being where you are and dealing with things directly? Right?
Well, all of the things you mentioned were more volatile and more important to me than the institutions that environmental groups became, because they involved human passion and involvement in a direct way. I don't know if you recall, but before 1972, there were these environmental heroes who were not mainstream people. They housewives. I learned about mercury poisoning in fish, in edible fish, from a woman who was at the UN Environment Conference, whose husband was a scientist and worked for University of Chicago in some capacity. And he had cut up a bunch of ocean fish and found traces of mercury. Well, he also had found traces of mercury in whitefish out of Lake Michigan, considerable traces, that he told his wife, she said this in public, well, he told me he didn't want to report them because it might possibly be damaging to his other research on, big ocean fish rather than this fish that everybody in Michigan eats. And she was the one that blew the whistle on mercury poisoning in domestic freshwater fish. It's pretty amazing. Yeah. And Love Canal, did I mention Love Canal? Or the Ohio River catching fire. The people that were involved with those things were regular people. These were not, people that had a career or an institution they were trying to keep going with the latest cause they could come up to, pull their wagon along. These were people that were directly affected. And among them, of course, were Native Americans. So Native Americans have to emerge from all this as a glowing presence, because I was involved with the American Indian movement. And when we were the diggers, we brought water out to Alcatraz in a boat. Freeman House of Totem Salmon, his first boat was a boat to bring water to Native American protesters on Alcatraz Island. And I knew these people quite well. I knew most of the principals involved with the American Indian movement, and I was in several demonstrations. And at the time, I knew Pyramid Lake from having gone to Pyramid Lake to look at it, because it had been a very important aspect of Western Native American culture. Pyramid Lake is very important. It's in the middle of an area that we call desert, and it's a huge lake, and it has all this significance. Well, Native Americans had to protest to disallow damming the Truckee River going into Pyramid Lake. I mean, it was just, don't the lights go on when you hear that? I mean, this is deep ecology. This is not deep ecology in the formal philosophical way, but this is living in nature and being very concerned about it. And then you go and say, well, why are you protesting this. I said, well, the mother is in pain and she needs us. She is being bled dry and will die if we don't take on her cause. Wow. Okay. Okay. So if you ask me what was for one of the questions is what is a significant text, Indian Tales is a significant text about Northern California ecology. You just have to be able to see, what Jaime D'Angulo is trying to do there. He's trying to take Western literature and put it into the tales and fables that were part of Native American culture. It really is an incredibly important book, Indian Tales.
Yeah. What about Earth First specifically? Like, one of the things that they kind of after the fact claim for Earth First, and I'm just kind of curious what your take on this is that its emergence had the effect of legitimizing a certain number of mainstream groups who had become characterized in the popular media as too radical. There was sort of contradiction between ecology and economy. And so when Earth First appears, then suddenly these mainstream groups get more credible and they're able to have more of an effect. But I'm just wondering, because it's sort of aside of what you're up to, you're really dealing with things in a much more direct way locally and internationally. But what was your sense of that happening, and did you think that was a worthy strategy on their part to follow that sort of inside-outside thing?
The effect that Earth First may have had on mainstream environmental groups was never really a big part of my own consciousness. Okay. I saw them in the same aggregation as the anti-nuclear movement or even the radical women's movement as a way to restate human identity relative to the urgent problems of our era. And I don't know if you're aware of it, our publication raised the stakes. The first issue had an exclamation point at the end of it. I always thought Earth First were encouraged to use an exclamation point because we had. And when I met Dave Foreman here and talked to him about, he asked to meet me, and I talked to him about what he was doing. And in that burly way of his, he said, well, we think we're the samurai, and we think you people are the villagers. We think bioregionalists are the people that we samurai have come to fight for. And I said, what does that make us, Dave? Geishas? But I saw what he was saying, and I thought of it in a similar way. I always thought of Earth First was pushing issues further than they had been pushed. Were you aware that loggers in Northern California had a bumper strip that said, Sierra Club, kiss my axe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen that.
Well, Dave Foreman said, Sierra Club, kiss my axe. And if that was coming from two directions, there must be another point out there to go to. I'm being a little Hegelian here, but if they're using the same expression, doesn't it lie out there somewhere?
Something's going on there. Let's see. There was something there that I missed that I wanted to get back to. Oh, what was your take on other organizations that were local in the Bay Area, that were doing local stuff? I mean, I know in the late 70s comes Citizens for a Better Environment, later known as Communities for a Better Environment, which followed a pattern of canvassing door to door. Greenpeace started doing the same thing. There were also a number of local initiatives from Save the Bay, Save San Bruno Mountain. Later comes sort of the Urban Creeks restoration efforts and things like that.
You're talking about really good things now.
Yeah, and I'm just kind of curious, how you interacted with them, what your sense of those were. And then aside of that, there's also the question of the left. And so there's sort of emergence of all these kind of eco groups that a lot of people kind of associate as left efforts, even though maybe they're not most of the time. But
well, the left was the active left was dragged kicking and screaming into an environmentalist and ecological perspective. It's taken a long time, and some of the divisive things that have happened because leftists were not quite making that adjustment. I give you Murray Bookchin, who became, increasingly more dismissive of anything that had earthly, biospheric sensibility. He's a very staunch anthropocentric person, Bookchin was. Mm-hmm. And his logic and his reason and all of that, very Platonic, Aristotelian, very logic-oriented. And, of course, his
Cartesian almost, really.
He might argue that, but he was absolutely, genuinely out of that very hard left era when Stalinists were yelling at Trotskyites and standing on street corners and becoming very good at being dismissive and ugly languaged with each other, which I'm sure you're a bit familiar with.
Yes.
At any rate, he was a product of that. And he was kicking and screaming all the time. I actually tried to incorporate some of his work because of the anarchist quality, anarchist kernel of it, into the ecological, the post-environmentalist ecological perspective that includes deep ecology and bioregionalism, Earth First as well. I tried to, and I always tried to remain a friend of his. I knew him from New York, and that very anti-American foreign policy period of the early 60s, the peace movement and so forth. That's where I met Murray. And I felt somewhat loyal to him. Anarchist. I knew some of the things he had done. He was a really on-the-ground person. But I think somehow his ego got involved with what he was doing, and he didn't want to be left out, and he wanted to be seen as extremely important, like his legacy. So he began picking fights with especially deep ecology people, which was really bad from my point of view. Even in San Francisco, the group that was called Urban Habitat, that group continued a black minority rights orientation and pushed it into the ecological perspective. Well, it's really interesting. I see how I saw it come in, but I didn't see it take a place in the room, if you can follow what I was saying. I was once at a meeting that was to protest the development of Potrero Hill with it was claimed that they were making a portion of a new housing development, very large development. I think it had 200-300 units. A very small portion was going to be for low-income people and for artists. And there were people, of course, low-income people and artists who said, yeah, this would be a great thing. Well, I went to a meeting and said, open space in San Francisco is a real rarity. And this was, by the way, completely undeveloped open space.
Is the part over the tunnel there?
Exactly, yeah, exactly. You've got it. It was old railroad land that maybe had some railroad tracks in a tunnel, but the rest of it was open space, and people used it as open space.
It's beautiful. The commons have become to life.
Exactly. At any rate, I was invited to join a group that were resisting it, and I got on stage, and the biggest opposition we ran into was from Urban Habitat, who just did not listen to the open space argument. From their point of view, that was an ideological, white, upper class, or privileged perception. And I'm looking at the guy and saying, is everyone here aware that this is the third most dense urban area in the United States that we live in, that we're bounded on all sides, that we can only grow up, and any open space that's left is totally precious here. I mean, whether it's declared a park or not. So I was being passionate about it. But I was amazed. And there were people who were identified with the left for a long time in San Francisco who were also of this frame of mind. Oh, come on, we've got to get income for these we've got to get housing for low income. People are being squeezed out of the city. Say, right, go to South of Market and knock down any one of those old industrial buildings, right? Why are you developing this? It's just because it's on Potrero Hill, and the developers feel that they'll eventually get more money for it than it's worth.
And they have the Goodman Group to give them political cover for that artist co-op space.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
oh, you remember all this?
Yeah, I remember it quite well.
David, we're in trouble. You know, this is like two people that operate independent of each other but know all the same history. This is ridiculous.
We actually have a pretty good presentation because Ronnie wrote a piece about how to fight city.
I worked with Ronnie on this.
Yeah, it's a good article.
Where was the tunnel? Where are you talking about?
It was on Potrero Hill. If you go up to 19th and Arkansas, that intersection collapsed at one point in 1960. Because the railroad tunnel that Northwest Pacific Railroad used to run through there had been closed for a long time, and kids were going in there and setting fires inside the tunnel, and it caught the beams on fire, and it led to a structural collapse. So after that, they filled the tunnel with cement and closed it off, and then for many years it was just a sort of empty, derelict land. So
you get the point. The tunnel was underground, so this left the surface area as
this was a steep area around that
vacant
tunnel.
open space.
And it turned out to have a certain amount of toxic contamination from the trains having spewed onto it for a long time, so it took a while to get it clean. But what happened is that the Goodman building, which used to be, the building's still there, but it was a whole, artist cooperative housing situation on Geary near Franklin. They got evicted in a very cause celeb type of moment in the mid-'70s, and they got money from Jerry Brown's, somebody, I think it was actually maybe Peter Coyote as the arts commissioner managed to give them some money. I don't know if he did it or somebody else. But they got $250,000 out of the state, and then Feinstein was guilted into matching it in the early 80s. And so they had $500,000. You go all the way to the Frank Jordan period. And now Jordan's trying to get stuff going in Northeast Mission, and when that area gets targeted over there on Potrero Hill as a place to build this new housing, and this developer wants to put up all these condos. And in order to get political cover, he brings in this Goodman Group who've been looking for a place to build their replacement artist co-op house, sort of like Project.
So-called artist co-op.
Yeah, it's too expensive to be that. And actually, Roxanne was there for a while. She owned one of the units. Roxanne Ortiz, and some people managed to get something out of it. Anyway, it was a very terrible thing. And then, of course, Ronnie was really involved in trying to resist that. And they got a special Anchorstein Brewery beer for that. And anyway,
but they did get built.
It all got built, and it's all there today. And there's a sort of a lush back garden space behind those condos, but that's about all it really is.
It's not low income. It's not artists. We all knew it. We all knew it was a scam. We're trying to be logical anyway, right? We're trying to make a logical argument. That's what I was doing with this open space density thing. But this thing was all sewed up.
You'd actually enjoy Dick Walker's new book, The Country and the City, because he has a big treatment of this relationship between environmental justice activism and the long history of fighting for open space in the Bay Area, and how that becomes a class conflict, whether it's right or not. You're a good example. This is a good example of where it was really inappropriate place to say this was a class division to fight for that open space. It wasn't about.
Thank you. I thought so.
Yeah.
But I also felt very alone.
Well, but that's the thing, is that it's just this whole legacy of it is like the whole history of environmentalism in the Bay Area and ecological activism has tended to be by wealthy people trying to save open space, and it's a tough thing to buck.
But he also said because of people's involvement in it is why it succeeded, and that it got more balanced. Doesn't he? Also makes an argument for working people being involved in it more here than other places, which is why it never became solely the premise of it. And
there's also a whole new development with the environmental justice in the last 15, 20 years.
In Pittsburgh, if you're ever there, there's a wonderful, I don't know what you call it, same thing, because they mined their own city. In the 1600s and 1700s, the mine was in Pittsburgh. These mines were coal and tin, and one of them freaking collapsed, and it's right near where my friends live, and so it feels like the city ends, and people are going in there walking their dogs, having picnics, and there's a few ruined houses in there, and it's probably dodgy at night, and you cross through, on the other side is a whole other urban, like commercial area. That looks like, Union Street or something, like with kind of flashy buildings, and then in the middle of it is this big, I guess it's an empty lot on a hill underneath which a mine collapsed, so you can't build anything on it. Hilarious. They say it's getting gentrified, but I hope there'll probably be a fight over it.
How's the time on this tape? Should we switch
Nope.
tapes?
14 minutes.
14 minutes. The next question that I want to get kind of fits nicely after this, because I was going to ask you, what's your sense of nature in the city? and the role of cities in ecological restoration, and that's kind of a good place to launch into describing how you came to start the Green City movement.
From a bioregional perspective, the city is in nature. The city is an urban overlay on natural systems. The facilities of a city, and the activities, water, energy, food, etc., should be geared toward the natural systems that the urban area has been overlaid upon. This will be done. It will be done from necessity. Right now, it sounds a little fairy tale-ish that urban areas are in nature, but in fact, I see the city of the future, and no development of the city in the future will be able to be done without accounting for these natural systems. And that's the ultimate sustainability, is to try to fit human activities and functions into the ongoing natural systems. For example, when San Francisco put solar panels on top of all the government buildings, which I wanted government buildings to be converted to renewable energy. In our book, Green City Program for the San Francisco Bay Area and beyond.
Published when? 1982?
1989. And by the way, so out of date now that I don't want to republish it. Almost everything in it has been accomplished in the last 20 years. When they put solar panels on government buildings to accomplish this, what I thought was requirement, that government buildings be powered by renewable energy, they chose solar cells which are manufactured someplace else, which require a whole industrial mentality for installation, whereas in the Bay Area this is the place where we should be using waves, tide, currents for getting energy, and all of those things have been proven to work. But it still is so outside the perception of planners as well as the public. They can't imagine, the city running on wave energy or the current of the Sacramento River or wind, any of the natural system features that we have. Instead, they want to import these systems that I personally feel they're clunky.
Yeah, a little bit like the biofuels phenomenon, similar kind of problem. It's just like
it is similar to the biofuels. I've never thought of it. I was interviewed recently about biofuels, and I said, forget it. They wanted me to applaud using kitchen grease to run automobiles. I said, why? Why? You know what kitchen grease would be good for? It'd be good for fodder for farm animals. Just soak corn with it, and pigs will eat it. Why in the world do you want to use it to run a car that smells like hamburgers or French fries? It's absolute nonsense.
And they have a film festival, and my friend didn't understand why I didn't get excited about the biofuel film festival. So
oh my God,
and do you need a whole bunch of movies?
More than one movie? That's my whole thing.
Where are we now?
Talk about the Green City Center that you have. Thought about for a long time.
It became clear to me, particularly, that although the bioregional idea is very suitable and accessible to people that live in the country, farmers and new back-to-the-landers and even suburban communities, the urbanites were going to be left out of the bioregional vision. And in fact, cities are probably the most important human settlements in bioregions, not because they have big names or because they're famous or because they've lasted a long time when they have. It's because of the concentration of human population and the consumption of resources. So if cities aren't bioregionalized, then the whole idea was going to fall apart. And so I set out to round up the people that I knew were working in various fields, renewable energy, redesign of parks, urban gardening, water, recycling, all of those areas, and bring them together for meetings in which we could participatively and collectively and communally and mutually come up with sets of ideas and principles, and then that was all put into a book called A Green City Program. And that book has been the most popular publication we've done. It's used in a lot of places. I often see it in planning department libraries. At any rate, we went through several printings of it. We stopped, as I said before, because it became out of date. Almost all of those things have been accomplished in some way locally. But we then began a Green City program to try to run a current of commonality among urban environmental groups, that essentially we all were doing something similar, but it was on a different level. It wasn't on the immediate level in front of us. Butterfly preservation. But if you put together butterfly preservation and renewable energy and a lot of other ideas, then you could have this green city common purpose. And we thought the best way to do that was through education. So we started a program called Education Plus Action, which was to bring one day of bioregionally oriented ecological activity into a school. We did this by contacting teachers. And I was criticized by a number of groups, by the way, for not going for the administration heads and going for the teachers. Well, we got together a mailing list of teachers and wrote to them and said, would you like your class to do a recycling project or a garden or restoration of native areas project for your school? And it was really overwhelming enthusiasm from teachers to do this. So without even consulting the administrations, which I never did, we went into schools with the teachers and experts and volunteers who were full of enthusiasm to help, and brought the students step by step through some of these processes, and all the time saying it fits into a wider view. You know, by doing this in your school, you're helping make this green city. A green city is not a cosmetic green. This kind of green city that I was talking about was fundamental. Really big changes in the way urbanites conceive of their habitat.
Right.
As habitat,
Water,
for example.
food, et cetera,
Yeah. And of course, you know, things are moving in that direction. For example, in the Bay Area, the most exciting new ecology groups are the ones that want to restore natural systems, creeks, daylight creeks, nature in the city, shorelines, even this Sunday Streets thing. When we did it down by the ferry building, and we showed people maps of San Francisco, and that they were standing on landfill, and that it used to be the bay, and people would just grab other people and say, "Did you know this? Did you know that the bay used to be here? What can we do about that?" I said, well, you know, well, first of all, now you know, so, you know, let it fester. Yeah, come up with your own idea.
The seas are rising, so they'll take care of that problem pretty soon.
Right.
I realize that there's a flashback question I want to go to, which is the Open Space Initiative in '72. Did you have any relationship to that going on at the time? I know you're not much of an electoralist, but I wonder if you were involved around the political time where people were fighting for open space.
I wasn't involved. I think I was probably educated by it. Yeah. I wasn't directly involved with it. I wanted to make one point with you. To me, it has never been a blank slate to recreate our identity on. We have been involved with the late industrial era of human civilization, planet-wide. That's what's in common between communism and capitalism. They're both based on industrialization. What we've lived through is to be able to observe what industrialization has done to our minds and what it's done to the environment. And it is from my point of view, it is our challenge to try to retake a human species identity in the biosphere. And when I say retake, it's that that spirit that drove people to make paintings in caves 25,000 years ago. It's that spirit to see value as not being necessarily economic, as having much more to do than economics, to not subject people to the oppression of industrial concepts and activities, and to make them soft-shoed planet murderers, which is what they are. That's my goal, is to try to get past that into whatever the next era is. And smack right in front of us, after enumerating so many problems, desertification, running out of water, destruction of habitat, pollution of rivers and land, bang comes climate change. The big summation of all of that. And our need is to create the poles to vault over that stop, that terror, and get onto that other thing where we're living harmoniously with the earth. That is our biggest goal, from my point of view.
And I think you can credit yourself, because a lot of this stuff, as you say, your 1989 program, comment on what you think might have been setbacks or distractions, eco-campaigns that were setbacks or distractions for the bigger agenda of altering the relationship between humanity and planetary ecology. That's probably it. And then if there's anybody you want to point us to, or any last words. So there's about 4 questions in that, and we'll just kind of go
All right.
through.
Why don't you frame one of them just for me?
Yes. Well, one that's just kind of a big, broad question that you probably have answered already, but because I just like to see if you might say something slightly different about it, or even radically different. How were the big issues framed when you first started thinking about ecological politics, and how's that changed? How are they framed now? What are those key questions?
The biggest change from environmentalist politics to ecological politics, for me, is the difference between protest and proactive approaches. And really, the last 10 years, the proactive aspect of environmental or ecological thinking has been the strongest. And it's finally coming on, which is to readapt human activities to the realities of natural systems and bioregions, to be a little ideological for a minute.
Well, that connects to the ecology and work thing, too, because I think that's really where you see that people are doing this work. It's outside of what they get paid to do for the most part, but maybe you can talk about and work that into the further into your answer.
Well, there is a contemporary urban person who's very visible. Person who rides a bicycle, dumpster dives, lives 6 in an apartment, wears borrowed clothes. In fact, I think the fashion style of the Mission District is pretty much just recycle clothes of your friends.
No, it's clothes that are bought that look like they're recycled.
In the Mission District?
That's the secret, David. Come on.
I wouldn't wear those things to my 3 days.
He's a pop culture critic.
Yeah, he knows too much.
And these same people will work for, they go from environment group to nonprofit to environment group. I heard someone describe himself as a nonprofit slut, meaning he wouldn't work for anybody else, just worked for nonprofits. So there is this new urban person, and they're the ones that are responsible for these median plantings you see all over the city. That wasn't a city program originally. Those were people in neighborhoods, especially there on Guerrero, where it looked like an airstrip of like 8 lanes of traffic, and a median that had nothing in it, and people began planting it. That was a neighborhood organization originally. Yeah. And then the city picked it up. City does pick up things slow and late, but does adapt. And that person and that culture, that's the sustainability culture, is coming out of those people.
Is that going to ring a lot?
Not going to. It depends on which one. One of them's going to answer upstairs.
There, it's gone.
Good.
Yeah.
I think the sustainability lifestyle is coming from those people, and they do tend to be in their 20s. They do tend to hang out together, be a little clannish, coffee house culture, that kind of thing.
You've seen Dolores Park lately? The people are just totally occupying that park now as an open public commons. All day, every day. You just go over there, there's hundreds of people out on the lawn.
Well, I was there to see the free exchange thing revived.
Oh, yeah, that's pretty fun.
That was
The free store.
remarkable.
The really free market?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny, the diggers are picking up some cachet among these people, and to me it's, especially if I tell them, well, it was a theater, and if you do it as theater, I understand what you're doing. If you're not doing it as theater, tell me,
What is this?
Yeah, where are you getting the stuff, for example,
Right.
The people that started it actually were inspired by the diggers. They actually say that almost positive. It's Kirsten.
Right, and Heather, yeah.
Well, there have been people in their 20s that have been by here to ask me why we did what we did, how we did it, where did we get the stuff, etc. I mean, logistical problems. How do you do the digger do?
Yeah. Lots of ways, secret ways, some of them. So that, the way you were just describing that Mission District character made me think that here's your re-inhabitory citizen, if you will. Like these are people who are thinking about living in the city in a new way and are finding at least the early stages of ways to do that. And some of them are, spending a lot of time in community gardens or going to the really free market, or they're riding their bikes in various ways, etc. So
Who's the woman that's putting up those murals that have
Mona.
things like the digger free store in them and
that's Mona Caron.
wild corridors? The last one I saw, for years I've been talking about there should be a wild corridor going from San Bruno Mountain to Golden Gate and from the bay to the ocean. She has wild corridors in some of her murals.
Yeah, and I actually put it in my novel too. And she and I used to live together, so she got a lot of your ideas through me.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I really I think we've got one of her things.
Yeah, that's one of her work.
He's in it.
I'm in all of her murals.
He's actually one of the
You're
people.
always in one. That's great.
We broke up. We're not lovers anymore, but we had a good 5.5 years.
Well, that's flattering.
Yeah, it was flattering for me too. Are there any organizational histories that you consider indispensable for understanding the history of Bay Area ecological activism? That is yours.
Ecological activism.
Yeah, like your own, but probably I'm asking more about it. If you think of other groups that are their histories are important for knowing that history.
Well, you're asking it. It sounds a little academic.
It's okay.
Well, if you're talking from an academic standpoint, of course, the early Sierra Club. Start with John Muir. Start with the Ohlone Native people. Don't leave out the poets who flocked to Big Sur in the 1930s and weren't leftists and were nature worshippers. I would think almost every group when it began had, especially when it was it was oriented around a particular issue. Any of those groups would have been worth studying, especially, from an academic point of view, or if somebody who was in college to know about them. For my own experience, I think the best thing a person can do is jump into nature and jump into social political reality and see what happens there. How do you live? Just keep track of what you do, not necessarily what you should do or what you think is a hip thing to do, but what you have to do to live. Keep track of it and think, how can you do that ecologically? That's more important to me than anything anyone could study. And the people that do that will come up with information you don't know and contribute to this pole vault over the wall of climate change.
Do you think there could be ecological sanity in a world system based on growth? Or do you think growth maybe is a word that can be redefined in some new way that would allow the world as we know it to go along?
David Suzuki, who is a conservation biologist, says that there is a natural growth increase phenomena in natural systems. For example, forest. But it's not on the scale of 10%. It's 2% or less. And steady state to 2% is an ideal in terms of ecosystems. I don't have the background really to make that statement because it's a comparative statement. You would have to know about a lot of different ecosystems to make it. But if it is an accurate generality, that would sound right to me. And prosperity is not a bad thing. But there are all kinds of prosperity. Living simply with style, elegant simplicity, all of those ideas are, to me, the more worthwhile than the productivistic 10% return on your investment, do bigger and better every year sort of drive. That's what's, I think that's a product of industrial society.
Absolutely. Do you have any technology fix fantasies, like for this pole vaulting problem that you were referring to, or anything else? And how heavily do you credit such thoughts versus, say, transform social relationships, or are they even separable?
Technology is part of human nature. Was it Alaskan Inuit Park is supposed to have something like 60 plus different types of fur in it. Even an arrow, with the tip of the arrow, the adhesive to fix it to wooden shaft, the feathers to guide it, the bow to pull back to shoot it. It's a very high form of technology. In fact, there have been some really good technologies that have been abandoned or skipped over by industrial demands and systems. I'll give an example. In Ecuador, where we've had Planetary Foundation's had a project in Ecuador for 10 years. And I was talking to an anthropologist one day, and he said that there were natural depressions in the ground that were visible from satellites all over Ecuador. They're 10 feet to 100 feet, usually very round, shallow. And these are remains of them. And that what they are, the word for them in Ecuador, Spanish word, is alberado. It's a type of well that stores water in the soil. So it acts as a pond during rain, but then shunts the water into, for example, a hillside as a bank. Then you draw the water out of the bank by planting below it and either digging into it, into that wet ground. It ends up raising the water table, is essentially what it does. If you have a lot of them in one area, it really raises the water table. I mean, hugely, significantly. Almost 100 feet from that, and puts the water right below the surface, so it's accessible. In fact, the agricultural technology of the so-called primitive people of Ecuador was to plant different crops at different points along a hillside, depending on how much water they needed, with the ones that needed water the most at the bottom, and the ones that needed the least at the top. So they grew crops according to being able to tap this underground water bank. Well, most people have never even heard of this idea. And it was so common that there are thousands of them visible from satellites just in Ecuador. They also exist in Colombia. And by the way, Ecuador, Colombia is also where agriculture originated in the Americas. Cultivation of yucca, for example, which is still cultivated there.
Interesting.
So my point is that there are a lot of technologies that we could be reusing that we're not using that are elegant, simple, and beautiful, and ecologically harmonious.
Yeah.
I would like more energy to go into that sort of anthropology of sustainability rather than into mechanism of sustainability. And my personal dream is to see a living object on the wall that controls the temperature in your house by shutting windows and opening other windows and closing doors, and an organism that even has feelings. That's my idea of like a biotechno phenomena would be that for me, not gene manipulation, but somehow seeing the organismic quality of technology and using it.
Nice. I actually thought of biobulbs once upon a time as
A what?
biobulbs. Like they should be able to just draw directly from sunlight and then store it in through a photosynthetic process and using like the fireflies.
David, would you get this guy out of here? I mean, he's going to start answering these questions.
Yeah, no, don't worry. I'll stop right
But you got it. You got it.
Yeah.
Biobulb. I'm going to quote you with that one,
that one.
Carlson.
So here's a question for you. What eco-campaigns historically would you say were setbacks or distractions to a bigger agenda of altering the relationship between humanity and planetary ecology? Who do you want to call out? Maybe
The trash talking part of the
Well,
interview?
it's a thoughtful, critical moment. That's all.
Well, I think a considerable amount of the food scares business is misdirected that way. I don't. It's hard for me to get enthusiastic about someone saying that somebody had a rat eat some part of some product in a factory, and therefore recalling all of that food is in order. I really am not particularly sympathetic with that. On the other hand, there's a real distinction that I can see between positive ecological, political situations and events that are different from a lot of them that environmentalism has paraded. The crucial division for this, for me, was the Peripheral Canal in Northern California, which the Sierra Club supported. This is a scheme to divert the Sacramento River around San Francisco Bay and send it to Southern California. This is 1 million acre-feet of water a year would be in this project. The bay would shrivel. Saltwater intrusion would go beyond Stockton, would go up the Sacramento River.
It's insane.
It's totally insane. And it was thought of as being the way to solve the Los Angeles Metropolitan Water District's problems of growth and the fact that they were going to lose the Colorado River as a source. So it astonished me that the Sierra Club was for it. And I had to do some research to find out why. The reason was that the state government had said that they would supply water, fresh water, to one in particular, a sanctuary for preservation of birds. And because that was the first time the state had listened to any ecological condition for a major project, the Sierra Club was for it. And Friends of the Earth said they couldn't make up their mind whether it was good or bad.
David Brower?
Yeah, that was under Brower. So we began a group, Planet Drum began a group called the Frisco Bay Mussel Group, MUSSEL for the creature, and Frisco to put it on the street level, because in spite of what anybody in the high society of San Francisco may wish, Frisco is still a name that the city is known by for ordinary people. So Frisco Bay Mussel Group began holding informational meetings, not against the canal, but where do we live? What does the bay do? One of our meetings was just to have a show by Bob Carroll, the genius one-person performer who did a salmon show. and he did a show where he became a salmon and acted out salmon. He was an incredibly brilliant performer. At any rate, all the people that went to these meetings sat and watched a guy dance out salmon. We also, there were people talked about geology or talked about different species. At any rate, that group put together a book that I titled Living Here. Probably the best title we ever had for anything, Living Here. And a map of the Bay Area watershed with endangered species and whatever. And a little jingle about where water comes from and where it goes. It came from the mountains and it goes out your toilet in this jingle. And did that as public information. That was going to be our backup. Then our political move was to take out a one-page ad in the Chronicle. Somebody donated the money for this. That said, stop the vampire ditch and what is the Peripheral Canal? What is it going to do? With coupons at the bottom. This is the one that really worked. The coupon said, I withdraw my membership from the Sierra Club until you change your position. I withdraw my membership from Friends of the Earth until you withdraw your position. And this was in the Chronicle, and the Sierra Club and Friends of the Earth started getting these coupons. And the ad was reproduced in the legislature. And when the vote went on in the legislature voted against it. And that was the first, from my point of view, the first bioregional mainstreamed political victory. And by the way, before that campaign, knowledge about the Peripheral Canal was minimal here. After it, people knew what the Peripheral Canal was. They would say, oh, that's that thing that shipped water down to L.A., isn't it?
Yeah, all you have to do is mention that now, associated with a new water proposal, and immediately everybody's like, oh no, don't call it that, don't call it that.
Yeah, right.
When was that? Peripheral Canal?
Early 80s.
I remember seeing a documentary about it, or even in Texas. Somebody had done a news report like a 60.
Well, you, David, you're a specialized audience for these documentaries.
Not in 1982, I wasn't.
That's the second one you've mentioned that I've never heard of.
Well, I don't have any. The big wrap up here is really, is there something you'd like to say that you haven't already told us? And then there's kind of a broad question about, tell us about other people whom you've met in ecological politics over the years that you think are some good anecdotes associated with them. But you've told us a lot already, so.
There are so many areas that are still unexplored for living together on the planet. That's our big future together, is the mutual identity of the human species. And living on the planet together in the biosphere has so many directives that come from anthropology, from natural science, from seeing human beings as species, people, instead of characters who belong to specific cultures who are not identifiable with each other in any way. Our projects have been in Japan, Australia. There's a very large bioregional group in northern Italy that publish a magazine titled Lato Selvatico, Wild Side. In South America, Canada, Japan, during the Bush administration, of course, which, it's feudalistic or something. I mean, those guys are back in the Middle Ages, medieval. Well, they actually give medieval a bad name. During that period, several countries just ran ahead of the United States. Germany is way ahead. Spain, I think 25% at least of their national energy comes from wind and other alternative sources. The city of Barcelona is almost entirely set up to become renewable energy derived. Anyway, there's so many of those things that are untapped, and so many programs and policies that are possible. It's really a new world that way. It's a new planet, so to speak, if you look at it in a post-industrial way. And post-industrial here isn't meant in an acute, stylistic way. It's meant meaning living with ecologics as a more important entity than economics, and what kind of change that's going to make. So my personal feeling is that it lies with younger people. In Ecuador, we teach a bioregional education program as an after-school program for high schoolers. It's very popular. We just tripled the size of it. Yeah, small grant. It's amazing how much you can do with a little bit of money in South America. And the kids from that are going home and telling their parents, don't throw away organic material, make compost, put the compost on trees, plant fruit trees in the backyard. All these sustainability-oriented ideas, and they're full of restoring the forest and keeping the river and the bay and the ocean clean. We think that's a good place to put your energy. It doesn't always work out, doesn't all work out, but if you're going to do something for hope, do it with younger people and see what happens to it.
Yeah, no, I like that approach too, where you really approach it at the level of how you think about the world in a broad sense.
Exactly.
What are the processes that are going to make a good life from here on out?
Right.
In a different logic altogether.
But I can think of myself as a citizen of the city of San Francisco in the state of California in the United States of America, or as inhabiting a Shasta bioregion at the mouth of the Sacramento River estuary on the North Pacific Rim of the Pacific Basin in the universe. I opt for that identity. I'm not going to buy into the other one. I'm just not going to flatter them that they can get away with that with me.
Yeah, good. All right, well, that's excellent. Thank you, Peter.
You're welcome.
Wait, my turn. Well, you don't have to sit down. These are just questions I'm just curious about. One, before I forget, Chris.
Yeah.
I really like the idea of him talking about poets who got into the ideas early. I think you should add one poet, and maybe not like a Gary Snyder type poet, but actually a poet who was inspired by the environmental movement. Or
Lou Welch.
I mean, yeah, somebody.
Yeah, Lou Welch.
Lou Welch is a good
That would be like
Lou Welch's star has not yet risen. He's dead, but he just hasn't broken the horizon.
I've heard of him. I don't know.
You have?
Yeah, I don't know what it's like.
Draw a circle around you wherever you are. Within that circle are 300 things nobody knows very well and maybe has never seen. How many can you find?
Is that one of his?
Yeah. That's called Step Out Onto the Planet.
Wait, was he from here?
Yeah. Well, originally Chicago. He was a journalist from Chicago.
And I've also heard about that 50s scene in Malibu. Mike Davis mentions it a couple times.
Malibu, okay. But Big Sur was there.
Big Sur, too. That would be kind of cool.
There's a really funny article in Harper's called Sex and Anarchy on the West Coast, written in 1946. It's about the scene around Henry Miller and the whole thing.
Christopher Isherwood went there, too.
How good. How good.
Do you have that? Those are kind of my early heroes.
Yeah.
And I had a Digger question.
You know, Kerouac ran into all those Lou Welch people, and that's Dharma Bums. And Dharma Bums is quite ecology-oriented.
Really?
Well, I don't know if Kerouac knows it. I don't know if he knows.
I doubt it.
What he's run into, but he does. He was a gifted reporter. Did you know he wanted to be a sports writer? Yeah. So he studied journalism. I mean, that's what he wanted to be. And he just said what they were talking about. But Albert Sijo is in that book. Lou Welch, Lenore Kandel, Gary, of course, but other people too who were, nature, passion, human, sensuality oriented. It's a good book.
Pretty ego.
What can I ask a Digger's question?
The Diggers?
A Digger's question.
Yeah.
What did 1% free mean? Isn't that what was on some?
I thought we needed a poster. And a photographer named Walter Genthy had made a lot of photographs of San Francisco during the earthquake, the aftermath, actually. One of them is of two Chinese Tong men leaning against a wall on Jackson Street. And why that's in the middle of these photographs of the earthquake, I really don't know, but there they were. And these guys are a little bit like thugs, but they're also very cool. They're very relaxed. They're leaning against the wall. They both got cigarettes in their hand, and they've got these uncrowned hats that, Chinese like to just pull them out of the box and put them on their heads. I always liked that photograph. It seemed to me so outlaw San Francisco looking. And it's not white guys. It's these Asian guys. So I had that in my mind to do something with it, and the Hells Angels have a patch that says 1%, because somebody wrote a magazine article saying these thugs that ride motorcycles are just 1% of the motorcycle riding public who are clean, prosperous Americans like you and me. It's like, so the Angels took that and pride and put it on their jackets. So very often you see 1% on a Hells Angels jacket. And so and we kind of hung out with the Angels at that time. At any rate, we were doing things free, and it all went together as 1% free. That what we were saying was we were 1% of the population doing things free, that 1% of everything could be seen as free. It was like, evocative, not provocative, evocative. So it was evocative. When I saw it on paper, I thought, well, I don't really know what this means. I really like it, though. It makes my head open up. So I asked an artist friend to blow up the Genthi picture, take a stencil, air gun blue paint, like, denim blue. The faces of the guys we Xeroxed separately, and then cut them out and pasted them on this air gun thing that's, I have one upstairs, they're huge. I mean, the poster was very large. And it said 1% free at the bottom. And we began putting them all over San Francisco. I really, you're an artist. Where do these ideas come from?
No, I mean, that's the perfect answer. Like,
the merchants on it.
And you weren't quite sure what, but you knew it made sense to you, and so you made it.
And it's still rolling after all these years.
Yeah, well, a lot of the merchants, so-called hip merchants on Haight Street at that time, thought it was a direct threat. They thought it was extortion, that we were asking for 1% of their money.
That's a good one, too. That's kind of
that's really evocative. I was stunned.
As long as they're just offering you the money, it's fine. Yeah.
And then later, we come with Ben and Jerry's. Speaking of hip capitalists, and they started to do a thing called 1% for the environment from their company. And me and my roommate were like, whoa, wow, there's really to 1% of your profit. Wow, what a guy!
Yeah, what a nice guy.
It's kind of a cool. It has like a thug thing, but you're also saying I'm not even asking for much.
We
give me 1% of your profit.
Well, we put them up. We put them up on freeway stanchions. These were the three places. It had to be in a neighborhood, on a freeway stanchion, or on a bank building. And we put one in Chinatown with flour paste. So they're ruined. I mean, you couldn't get them off the wall. And somebody wrote in, put a
speech bubble.
A little speech bubble.
Yeah.
It said, you round eyes are 1% free. Chinese are 101% free. I thought that was great.
Those commentaries were great.
That was great. Yeah, we were asked a lot about that. But on the other hand, there were people that saw it and just went, yes. Well, Chinese Tong men don't look like normal Americans, It's like that's kind of anti-establishment. And 1% free, it's the sound of it somehow got in people's heads.
Cool. Is that it?
You got your answer?
Yeah.
Don't ask me about Planet Drum, okay? Because that's another whole evocative trip.
All right. And there's your...
You guys are the same as I am that way. I mean, it's obvious to me you can understand everything I'm saying.
Oh, yeah.
You may not agree with it, but I know you understand.
No, I thought it was a really great interview.
Oh, thank you, Chris.
Yeah, you bet.
Thanks for doing it.
Hey, it's my pleasure. And I'll give you a DVD of the whole thing at some point, too.
Okay, you're going to do a good editing job, I'm sure.
Well, we'll probably give you the raw DVD if you want it. I don't know if you collect such things. You want to just
I
have
mean,
a-
do you want the full? If you want a full hour and whatever, half an hour, and half
Sure,
of you talking
sure.
unedited. That's we
Yeah.
can do that. It'll be a minute. We gotta get all into a drive and all that stuff.
Yeah, it won't happen tomorrow, but it'll happen in a few
Okay.
weeks, within a few weeks.
It's a very nicely done shirt.
Oh yeah, I'm not actually a big Yusun Ndur, whatever his name is, fan.
Oh, yeah,
my mom
Yusun
went and
Ndur.
saw him, and I know I really like it too. It's
How do you turn this thing
Oh,
off?
is that who it is?
open. It's inside.
I am a
So
big
so
fan
it
of
can't get
his.
hit. Really? I don't like
Yeah.
his recent music as much, but I like.
Have
it.
you been to a live concert?
No, are they good?
When the Liberians and Nigerians show up and take over the
Oh,
stage,
that's a rocking
man,
show, yeah, for sure.
what a number that is. You know, there are people that dance better than the people in his group,
Yeah.
and the people play music on the level of them as well. It's
I remember
wonderful.
seeing a Kanda Bongo Man one time at Slim's. They're from then Zaire, now the Congo.
I don't know that.
And they're
name.
just like the ones ensembles with like 14 people on stage, including these 3 very large women dressed all in gold. And they're up there just doing this come hither thing to everybody in the audience, and we're all just like going completely nuts because it was such intense music combined with this extremely hypnotic engagement with these women, you know. And then there was 3 guys doing music. You know, you get
Well, the audience gets on stage with him
Oh yeah, they did that too.
and jump in the air and go. And I thought, wait a minute, you know, I'd much rather do this kind of thing with you than some of the things that come up.
I bet you get asked a lot. Huh?
I'm just tired of it. I'm
sure.
tired. Well, except the few things I told you that you could say I was excited about. The Digger thing and so forth, it's all someplace now. You know, it's all been written down. It's all been analyzed, all that. But you know yourself, if you live long enough, what happens is you develop these tree rings, and somebody starts talking to you like, oh, you're the Chris Carlson of, what was the... Process World, or what was that booklet you put out about the Ombagombo, or I'm not pronouncing the word correctly. Boko Boko?
Oh, Bolo Bolo.
Bolo Bolo.
Yeah, I didn't actually put that out, but I know the guy that I was pretty good friends with the guy that.
Well,
did.
you helped.
I wrote
get
some
it
stuff
out.
for it too. Yeah.
Yeah. So they think of you as that person, not, you know, who is this guy now who's in his you're 60 something,
52.
52. So I've got several of these tree rings.
Yeah.
You know, one of them is the civil rights stuff.
Yeah, that was
Believe it or
interesting. I was
not.
glad you talked about that. Actually, yeah, that story's not.
Uh-huh. Yeah, but Meme Troop and Diggers and the early bioregional stuff and Green City and now working in Ecuador so much, they're all like...
yeah, you're a thick tree trunk.
They're not ever present in my mind. You know, I'm always thinking about how to solve the new problem.
But you're still
whatever it
going.
is.
That's the thing. You haven't.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the thing about being like in the world, right? Is you do develop these layers, as you say. I think it's a nice metaphor for it. But hey, the work is ahead of us. It's still something we're doing. It's not like we've stopped.
hardly begun.
Oh yeah, that's what it feels like. And then
Especially
isn't it
with
painful
the
how
big
short
stuff.
we're here. I mean,
Yeah.
I think about mortality more now that I'm in my 50s, and it's like, damn, we just don't have enough time doing all the things we want to do. But why are they right? This guy's gonna hit me in the head. That's why, right?
Hit me in the head. Or so many of the Jews. You know,